Okay, I guess it's time to start. Welcome, everyone. Good to see you in our new virtual world. My name is Isabella Weber. I'm an assistant professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. And I'm happy to be here today with Sina, who will introduce himself.
Yes, so I am Sina. I'm director of program at Collège International de Philosophie in Paris and lecturer at the University of Paris. And I just finished a PhD in the philosophy and epistemology and history of economics on Marx, Mises, and Friedman. And I'm very happy to be here, and thank you so much for your participation.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for being here, for taking out the time to listen to our presentation. I think it's interesting that this has been labeled Marxist economics, since there's a good contingent of Austrian economics in here. But that makes it even more interesting, I guess. So the order of presentation will be just like as it is in the program. And given that we only have two papers for this panel, we have decided to present each paper first, followed by question and answer from you, and then the next paper. To be aligned with the order in the program, I will go first, and we will then look forward to Sina's presentation. Okay, just to make sure that no one thinks there's a technical issue, I have decided to not use a PowerPoint presentation just to avoid any technical issues. So without further ado, let me jump right into my presentation. The title of my paper is The Possibility or Impossibility of Rational Socialism, Mises in China's Market Reform Debate. I think that this topic is immediately relevant to the current juncture that we are at. Clearly, the global order that has evolved after the end of the Cold War is hitting its limit, or is at least being very violently questioned. So going back to the 1980s to ask how that order emerged, and in particular how China has been integrated into the global economy, seems to be pertinent to the present crisis. Nevertheless, of course, my paper has a much more narrow topic than that. The topic is really how Ludwig von Mises became relevant to China's reform debate in the long decade of reform, that is from 1978 to 1992, or from the beginning of the Deng Xiaoping era to the restarting of reform after the Tiananmen crackdown. More broadly speaking, this is also about how Chinese socialism became compatible with Austrian economics. This paper is an offshoot of a larger research project that I have conducted for my forthcoming book, How China Escaped Shock Therapy, in which I conduct an in-depth study of China's market reform debate in the 1980s. It's also related to two papers on China and neoliberalism where I ponder this relation from a broader perspective. To put it in simple terms, my argument in this paper is that Mises became relevant to the reconfiguration of China's political economy in the late 1970s, when reformers decided to give up on late Maoism, to give up on the notion of continuous revolution, on emphasizing the relations of production over forces of production, and when they gave up on the Maoist rejection of treating efficiency as an independent standard for economic policymaking or even political formations more broadly. In the late 1970s, Chinese reformers moved to elevating economic efficiency and rational economic management as guiding principles for reform and as guiding principles for the reorganization of China's society and economy. In this context, Mises' claim of the impossibility of a rational socialist economy becomes relevant to China's debates. In this paper, I'm using a range of sources. Most importantly, I'm building my analysis on a close reading of a set of Chinese articles on Ludwig von Mises in the 1980s and on interviews with some of the authors who have written these papers in the 1980s. in light of this being a history of economics conference, I've decided to emphasize the background in terms of the background that is needed to understand the broader Chinese situation rather than emphasizing the background that is needed to understand Mises. I hope this will work for this audience. So it's important to understand that in the late 1970s, von Mises in Austrian economics was not new to China. In fact, in the 1930s, China and Chinese economists were tightly integrated into the global economy and into global currents of thought. So Chinese students studied at the LSE, studied with Hayek. There were also foreign economists teaching in China, such as, for example, Augusta Wagner, who authored a textbook that has a whole chapter on Austrian economics. And as Rebecca Karl in her recent book, Magic of Concepts, shows, there has been not only an importation of Austrian thought into the Chinese discourse, but also a genuine critique of Austrian economics in China. That critique at the time had been led by one of the foremost translators of Marx, Ricardo, and Smith, a man called Wang Yanan, who criticized the wholesale importation of political economy as a discipline and science, and the importation of Austrian school idealism and metaphysics into the Chinese context. After the revolution, many of those who had promoted Austrian economics in China during the 1930s and 40s fled to Taiwan, where they organized the translations of the works of Mises, Hayek, Röpke, and other leading Austrian thinkers. In the People's Republic of China, there was also there were brief periods of an engagement with Austrian economics in the Mao era in late 1950s and 1960s, but this was mainly from the angle of critiquing Austrian economics. And this project of critique also resulted in translations. So for example, Hayek's Road to Serfdom was translated into Chinese in 1962. But that being said, I think it is important that the relevance of Austrian economics in the late 1970s takes a new quality. And just to give you some context on the late 1970s, I would like to read a quote to you from Lin Chun, from Lin Chun's book, Transformation of China's Socialism, which I think quite succinctly summarizes the dramatic shift that is happening in the late 1970s. So Lin Chun writes, "The communist dreamland of liberated individuals and in universal solidarity cracked in the People's Republic when the regime alienated itself from the population by allowing bureaucratic privileges on the one hand and excessive persecution of opponents on the other. But it was not until the revolution's emancipatory promises were broken in a feudal tyranny towards the end of the Cultural Revolution that many believed that much of the original communist strength had been destroyed. The exhaustion was so evident that the power transition after Mao died in September 1976 would be initiated by a coup to remove his widow Jiang Qing and her allies, an event that had been waited for and was celebrated in the streets. The breakthrough, no doubt, a case of political secrecy and Byzantine politics, nevertheless brought to the fore a broad consensus on the need of the country to open up, liberalize, and democratize." So in this moment of shift from the late Mao era to reform, the question of how to reorganize China's economy becomes relevant. In this moment, as I have mentioned, there's a rejection of the late Maoist emphasis on continuous revolution and a shift towards a more orthodox understanding of historical materialism, an understanding of historical progress that emphasizes economic development and the development of forces of production over class struggle and revolutionary social relations. This becomes codified in the 1981 resolution on certain questions in the history of our party since the founding of the People's Republic of China, where really the principle of catching up an economic development as the most important task to work towards socialism becomes the guiding principle. In this context, Rong Jingbin, at the time a translator at the Central Compilation Bureau, writes an article in China's leading economic journal, which is called Jingji Yanjiu, literally translated economic research, in which he investigates the contradictions in the Soviet model and moves on to argue for the introduction of comparative economic systems and the introduction of Mises' work to China. Rong argues that there are basically two views that can explain the contradictions in the Soviet model, where the Soviet model is based on central planning and universal public ownership. The first view of those contradictions would be that there is a co-development of the relations of production and the forces of production, but that this co-development is not always synchronous, which means that there are remnants of capitalism and bourgeois thought that would prevent the relations of production, the more socialist relations of production, to be in accordance with the forces of production at all time. This he labels as basically the Soviet view of contradictions within the Soviet model. And he argues there's a second way to understand those contradictions, which is the way that he prefers, which is that there's a fundamental contradiction. So not a contradiction that is carried over from the past, but a contradiction that is inherent in the relations of production, jumping ahead of the development of the forces of production, which is inherent in the Soviet model. So in other words, the relations of production had become too revolutionized, too socialized, at a moment when the forces of production, the level of material development, was still lacking behind too far. In Rong's view, this contradiction between the level of collectivization, the level of socialist relations of production, and the very low economic development created a need for a plurality of socialist models. Basically, this is an argument against the Soviet model as the only possible socialist model, and an argument for new and different forms of socialism. In searching for such a new model of socialism, Rong argues, comparative economic systems research would be key. And in this regard, the socialist calculation debate should be studied in China, and in particular, Mises' 1920 contribution should be considered very carefully, because after all, Mises claimed that a rational socialist economy was impossible, so China had to come up with its own way to overturn Mises' claim of the impossibility of a socialist economy. Mises, of course, argued that a socialist economy was impossible because planners could not design values that were in accordance with prices. And Rong then moves to Lange's intervention, saying that the use of a market mechanism to serve central planning could actually solve that problem. However, already at that stage, Rong criticizes Lange for being too idealist and as such not delivering the solution that China had to seek in terms of devising a new socialist model. However, he argues that Lange's use of bourgeois economics is instructive, and China should learn from Lange in using bourgeois economics as a way to devise its own new economic system that would be a new form of socialism. At that time, the use of markets within China was already widely discussed, and in fact, as early as 1979, Deng Xiaoping himself had legitimized the use of markets when he told a foreign journalist in an interview, quote, that it is wrong to maintain that a market economy exists only in capitalist society and that there's only a capitalist market economy. Why can't we develop a market economy under socialism? Developing a market economy does not mean practicing capitalism. While maintaining a planned economy as the mainstay of our economic system, we are also introducing a market economy, but it is a socialist market economy. So in this context, already in the late 1970s and early 1980s, Eastern European émigré economists such as Ottar Schick and Bruce had visited China, and so did Milton Friedman, and all of them had essentially argued for some form of market socialism. Interestingly, even Milton Friedman at this occasion argued that a Lange type market socialism would be strongly preferable over Soviet-style central planning. So in that sense, the notion of market socialism and also the connection to Lange was already there. It is this strand of argument that later on led to a big push towards comparative economic systems as the way to devise China's new model, which Dong Jingbin's intervention is part of. This same intellectual strand also came late in the late 1980s to argue for what they called package reform, at the core of which would have been a wholesale price liberalization in hope to achieve rational prices through liberalization that would have amounted to some sort of shock therapy. Basically, the project of this strand of radical market reformers was to devise a blueprint for a rational form of socialist economy. And in this context, Mises' question of whether rational socialism was possible was pertinent and encouraged this group of Chinese radical market reformers to come up with a wave of papers on Mises' contribution, discussing what they could learn for their own project of devising just such a rational socialism. Basically, what they argued, most of these papers, was that they rejected Mises' answer to the question that rational socialism was only possible under private ownership. So his answer to the question of whether rational socialism is possible, they rejected, but they did agree with his parameters of analysis, and they did agree with the ways in which he posed the question. So in that sense, Mises' contribution to the Chinese market reform debate, if you want so, was to set the parameters of the debate. In the first translation of Mises' economic calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth, a lengthy introduction to that piece basically provides a summary of the thinking of Chinese reformers at the time. Tellingly, this translation appeared in a new journal that had been founded in the mid-1980s, called Comparative Social and Economic Systems, which was set up to introduce comparative economic systems analysis to China and to basically lobby for a blueprint for reform with a form of price liberalization at its core, which, as I said, is in key elements similar to what has come to be known as shock therapy. So in this editor's introduction, we read that socialism has commonly been defined as Soviet war communism, and in fact, Mises too defined socialism basically as Soviet war communism, and that this definition of socialism would have led him to argue for the impossibility of rational socialism. However, they held, this does not mean that any kind of socialism would have to be irrational, since Mises, after all, also assumed that socialism would entail the abolishment of money-commodity relations. But in China by 1984, money-commodity relations had been officially reinstated and practically operational. So from that angle, they used Mises to rethink the relation between the market and public ownership, and the possibility of having rational economic, a new rational economic mechanism that would achieve an efficient resource allocation. Rungtingbin argues that, that the fact that not only China, but all socialist countries around the world at that time in the late 1980s were thinking about market reforms would have validated the Austrian claim for market universalism. This meant that there is an empirical trend towards the possibility of combining markets with socialism. However, the Austrian market universalism would also teach Chinese reformers that they could not stop by commodifying basically end products, but that they had to go as far with marketization as to include the means of production, finance, and labor. So what he was arguing for was really a wholesale marketization of the Chinese economy. Then he makes an interesting twist to his argument by suggesting that the essence of public ownership would be to facilitate accumulation of wealth. Therefore, the essence of public ownership was economic growth. Therefore, it would be perfectly possible to have fairly far-ranging private ownership or mixed ownership forms, as long as this ownership was enhancing the accumulation of wealth. So in other words, by watering down the requirement for public ownership, Rong Jingben makes his vision for a fully marketized socialism compatible with Mises' vision of what a rational economic order should be. Around the same time, there was also a revival of the study of the history of economic thought in China, and some first contributions came out that were analyzing the socialist calculation debate more from a history of thought contribution. One of the most prominent authors in that regard was Jiang Chunzi, a researcher who had initially been researching Eastern European reforms of socialism, and in the mid-1980s had a chance to be a visiting researcher at the University of Illinois, University of Berkeley at the Woodrow Wilson International Center. And upon her return to China, basically started a research program that provided a relatively comprehensive history of thought of the socialist calculation debate, discussing Pareto, Baroni, Taylor, Hayek, Robbins, Lange, and so on. So this research program had already started in the late 1980s, and in fact, it took on a new dynamism in 1988, when China was at the brink of another far-reaching opening. However, then cranked to a halt when in 1989, the massacre on Tiananmen Square happened and reform was basically stalled for the time being. Interestingly, when in the early 1990s, Chinese reformers worked towards restarting reform, restarting market reforms and re-legitimizing markets in China, the socialist calculation debate once more became relevant, and Jiang Chunzi, this same researcher, and her contributions to the history of economic thought came to play some important political role. At that time, in 1990, the then newly appointed Minister of the State Commission for Economic System Reform, Chen Xinhua, was searching for a narrative to support his ambition to restart marketization and to reintroduce the agenda of moving China towards a market economy. In this context, he commissioned a study from Jiang Chunzi that should review the international debate on market and socialism. So Jiang Chunzi compiled a review of the socialist calculation debate, going back to Baroni and all the way to Lange and so on, in order to argue for the restarting of a market reform agenda in China. In this study, she comes up with what I think is some kind of an innovation, that in that she takes Lange's turn of arguing for the use of a market under socialism to its logical end in order to arrive at an even more radical claim. Jiang Chunzi argues that from the perspective of the socialist calculation debate, market and planning were neutral means of resource allocation. If this is the case, one could not argue that the defining element of socialism or capitalism would be the market or planning. So in other words, capitalism could have planning and socialism could have the market. And she goes on to suggest that this is in fact what one could observe around the world in the late 1980s. In her view, Keynesians and what she calls neoliberals had agreed that even in Western capitalist economies, some degree of macroeconomic coordination or planning was necessary. So therefore, having planning could not be considered the marker for socialism, but reversely, having a market economy could also not be key to not being socialist. Now, with Mises, she argues that rational prices would be necessary and the only possible way to establish a rational economic order. However, Lange's suggestion to use a state-orchestrated trial and error mechanism to simulate the market, in her view, was not realistic. But the way out was that given that having a market economy doesn't make you capitalist, it would be possible for China to have a full market economy while still being socialist, as long as the goals that were pursued with that economy would be aligned with socialism, and as long as that economy was serving the goal of economic development, which was ultimately the best tool to move towards socialism, since it would elevate the level of economic development. When Deng Xiaoping restarted the reform agenda in 1992, he made several statements that sounded like references to Jiang Chunzi's article. And there have been some memoir statements coming out that suggest that her contribution, in fact, had some impact on the formulation of China's model in 1992 at the 14th Party Congress, when China decided that it would be a socialist market economy with Chinese characteristics, which until today is the official designation of China's economic system. So at that occasion, Jiang Zemin, who is commonly considered as one of the most neoliberal reformers in China, stated, quote, "Whether the emphasis was on planning or on market regulation was not the essential distinction between socialism and capitalism. This brilliant thesis," which pretty much sounds like Jiang Chunzi's thesis, "has helped free us from the restrictive notion that the planned economy and the market economy belong to basically different social systems, thus bringing about a great breakthrough in our understanding of the relation between planning and market regulation." So in sum, I think it is fair to say that on this very high ideological level of redefining China's economic system, the socialist calculation debate, and in particular, Ludwig von Mises' way of posing the question of the possibility of a rational economic order, had some influence on China's resolution on reforming its system. However, I would also like to warn against taking such a broad designation as the only way of understanding China's reform path. I think that in order to understand how reforms have actually evolved, we have to combine this with a study of on-the-ground research, pragmatic experimentation, and the logic of groping for stones to cross the river in order to move forward. I'll leave it at that. I shall say that I have written up this talk as a paper, so if anyone is interested, please feel free to email me and I would be delighted to share my paper. Thank you very much. Sina, I would just stop my presentation now.
I think, don't you want to see if you have questions maybe before?
Of course, yeah, of course, sorry. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
You're welcome. Because you have time, right? So So you can take 5-10 minutes if you want for the discussion. It should be all right.
Okay, great, thank you. I will read the questions now and will then answer them one by one. So if anyone has more questions, please feel free to ask them.
Isabella, if I may, just one thing. Apparently, when the video is recorded, people can't see the questions, so you are supposed also to read the questions out loud.
Okay, okay, thank you for that reminder. Okay, I do it right now.
Actually, who told me that?
Okay, so the first question from Jimena, I hope I'm not mispronouncing that name, Hurtado, is thank you for this interesting presentation. I have two questions. First, the separation between market economy, marketization, and capitalism seems to contest, for example, Friedman's view about how market economy, which he seems to identify with economic freedom, leads to demands of political freedom. Do you think what happens in China disproves this assertion? Second, in the same line, do you think giving room to mixed or even private ownership or even the redefinition of China's economic model led to changes in China's political organization? Okay, broadly speaking, I think this question is about the relationship between the economic reforms and the political reforms, which is a very strongly contested question in China at that time. In the late 1980s, there was a strong contingency of people who definitely overlap with those who were arguing for a blueprint type of reform and who were, broadly speaking, part of that comparative economic systems movement in China, that were arguing that economic reform had to come with political system reform. Whether this necessarily meant democratization or not was, I would say, a contested question. However, certainly it was the case that in the late 1980s, China's democratization movement reached its peak. So clearly there is, both intellectually as well as in terms of the actual dynamics, a relationship between economic liberalization and political liberalization, but it turned out that China managed to develop quite far in the regard of economic liberalization without necessarily combining this with political liberalization. So this also meant that the discourse in the 1990s shifted and that this explicit link between economic liberalization and political liberalization became less prevalent in economic circles. The second question is, compared to the original debate by Umberto Barreto, compared to the original debate, what specific new points or ideas were raised in the Chinese socialist calculation debate? Is the market and planning are always combined an example of a new point in your opinion? So on my mind, and I'm happy to be corrected on that. After all, I'm a scholar of 1980s China more than of the socialist calculation debate. On my mind, the innovation lies in arguing that a full-fledged market economy is compatible with socialism, which I believe is different from arguing that a market could be mimicked through some trial and error mechanism in Lange's sense. What Jiang Chunzi is arguing for is really an actual market economy with a full marketization of labor, full marketization of finance, and a full marketization of the means of production. So in that sense, I'm not sure if it is necessarily a theoretical innovation, but it is certainly taking the point of treating the resource allocation mechanism as a relatively neutral means of allocation to a new level in a way that I anyways haven't been aware that it has been argued elsewhere, but I would be interested to learn if Umberto, if you have any examples of other contributions to the socialist calculation debate that would go into that direction. Okay, I guess those were the two questions that I had. Are there any more questions?
May I ask a question, actually?
Of course.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to know, I mean, when they were having these debates about market planning and all the rest of it, and when they were trying to find, let's say, a resolution or a form of combination, what was the attitude towards basically Keynesianism? I mean, why didn't they try to simply put forward a Keynesian way of combining the two? For them, Keynes was like a bourgeois economist. How did they conceive his way of thinking the relationship between the market and the state?
Yeah, so to be sure, in this paper, I have exclusively focused on, now you disappeared, Sina. I've exclusively focused on von Mises and on the Austrian influence on that debate. In my book, I am being much broader. And while I don't think that Keynes as such was particularly prominent, there was certainly a Keynesian influence. So for example, James Tobin also traveled to China and gave a talk and so on. So there was certainly connections with Keynesians at the time. On my mind, the difference is that that what they were looking for was really a new rational economic order that would be devised from scratch, which I believe Keynes never provided such a blueprint type of thinking, which is the beauty of Keynesianism and the emphasis on discretionary policy making and so on, which means that you cannot devise a rational order from scratch, but that you have to work it out with what you find in the economy. And this latter view of starting from the given conditions and using the prevailing institutions as a starting point for reform was in fact the counterpoint to this kind of Austrian or Mises or neoliberally inspired reform perspective that I've presented in this paper. And in my book, I'm going at length deriving how this alternative perspective came about. But this alternative perspective, since it emphasized starting from the prevailing conditions, was more focused on empirical study, understanding the institutional dynamic within China, understanding how the institutions that were there could be transformed into institutions that can work in a mixed economy on the market, rather than studying Keynes and then introducing Keynes into the Chinese debate. So they came more from an inductive epistemological approach, if you want so. Therefore, they were less axiomatic in devising their outlook from specific thinkers. That being said, there's one important economist called Li Yining, who had studied so-called Western economics pretty much consistently throughout the Mao era, and he was certainly very well read in Keynesianism, in also more recent contributions to Keynesianism at the time. Of course, Joan Robinson's contributions were widely available because she, during the Cultural Revolution, famously sided with China, so therefore her works were also not considered something that should be censored quite as strictly as the contributions of other foreign economists. So there's certainly this contingence there, and thank you very much for asking that question. In that sense, my paper, by focusing on Mises, was very one-sided. But my book is looking at both sides. Okay, are there any more questions? If not, I would like to thank you all for attending, and thank you so much for your very, very enlightening questions. And I'll hand over to Sina.
So thank you so much, Isabella, for this extremely rich and informative presentation, which I really appreciated. I learned so many things, and I'm really interested in these questions. So it was very good to hear your talk. So so I've made some PowerPoint slides. So I'll be just sharing the screen of my computer with you. Hope you all get to hear me. Okay, so now I go to the PowerPoint presentation. Yes. Okay. so hopefully you all get to follow me, actually. So the title of my talk is a critique of the Marxian and neo-Ricardian non-normative models of exploitation-based capitalist accumulation. The title is a little bit maybe too long, but actually I hope I will make it much clearer as I move forward. Okay, so if you want, the starting point of my research and of this talk is the famous distinction put forward by John Nagle Keynes. He's the father of the more famous Keynes, the economist. The book is The Scope and Method of Political Economy, in which he divides this distinction between positive and normative economics, where basically positive economics is the study of what is, whereas normative economics is the study of what ought to be, or as he says it, is the study of economic ideals. So the question, if you want, is what should economics be mainly about, the study of the is or the study of the ought to be, and what is the relationship between these two fields, if you want. But in this talk specifically, I would like to argue that criticizing the existing order of what is can only be done from the point of view of an alternative order, which according to the critique ought to replace the existing order. But Marx and neo-Ricardian economists such as Piero Seraffa and Jan Stidman have argued that economics should focus on the study of the existing reality instead of focusing on the study of economic ideals. As such, even their critical analysis of what they call capitalism is supposed to be positive, that is non-normative. This is the position that I will try to criticize in this presentation. So I'll start with Marx, and in fact I will focus mostly on Marx, but I will say certain things which I hope will be informative on neo-Ricardians as well. So Marx, it should be noticed that wanted his analysis of the capitalist mode of production or the capitalist social formation to be non-normative, that is to say immanent. You should notice that in the title of the book, Capital, the word critique refers not to capital or to capitalism, but to political economy. So, and it should be noticed that before embarking on this project, Marx had criticized in the Communist Manifesto the phantasmagorical character of the critiques of capitalism, deployed by those he called critical utopian socialists and communists. These critiques had criticized the capitalist economy of their time on the basis of various social ideals. Marx considered these critiques and their projects to rectifying existing social injustices as fanatical and superstitious. The problem of them for Marx is that their normative ideals that they then used to criticize the injustices of their times, he thought that following Hegel's critique of Kant, he considered that such normative ideals were not objectively grounded and were therefore merely subjective and impotent. And he thought that only those ideals that are objectively grounded should be taken seriously.
Sorry, Sina, it seems like your presentation is not moving on.
It's not moving on?
Are you still on the first slide?
Oh, is it? Oh, because I'm moving on my screen. So there is this is the problem, I think, with the, let me see. If I put it like that, does it move?
Not for, the cursor is moving, but I only see your first slide.
So I think it should be something.
Maybe you have to start a slideshow.
I was in the slideshow, but did it change or not?
Unfortunately not. I mean, you can also just go on. I just wanted to let you know.
No, absolutely. So let me just start. I just stopped the sharing and I will do it again, okay? Maybe it will work. So so normally you don't see the screen anymore. So now I'm going to do, so I'm going to share my desktop, okay? So now, do you see my desktop?
Yes.
Okay, and now if I move on to the slides, do you see them now?
Yes, I think so, yes.
Okay, so when I move, do you see the movement?
Yes, now it's moving, yes.
Okay, and just before, is it good now?
Now it's perfect, yeah.
Okay, perfect. Okay. Sorry about that. So I'm glad that you said that. I apologize, actually.
No, no worries, thank you.
Okay, no, you're welcome. Yeah, so basically, So Marx is saying that only those normative ideals whose germs or embryos exist in a hidden way, in the midst of existing reality, ought to be taken seriously. Therefore, instead of proposing normative ideals and criticizing the situation on their basis, one should study positive reality in order to discover where these hidden germs and potentialities reside. If for Marx, most bourgeois economists had sought to prove the natural and therefore eternal character of capitalism, he thought that it was necessary to develop a positive theory capable of proving in a positive and not subjective or normative manner that capitalism, like any other social formation before it, is destined to vanish. Marx therefore intended to show that capitalism is problematic not from the perspective of a subjectively conceived normative ideal, but from the point of view of the laws that govern its becoming. And in order to do so, he obviously devised a modified version of the Ricardian labor of value. And he tried to show that by developing this analysis of capitalism, we can deduce a law, the idea of the tendential law in the tendential fall in the rate of profit, that he considered already in the Grundrisse in every respect the most important law of modern political economy, the most essential for understanding the most complex relations. So you see, Marx's attempt is to show positively that capitalism is destined to vanish. And it is not really a critique of capitalism in the sense of a normative critique of capitalism. In order to prove the idea of the falling rate of profit, the hypothesis, of course, as it is well known, he devises this distinction between labor power and labor, which leads to the distinction between necessary labor time and surplus labor time. The idea is that in capitalism, the drive is to decrease the former and increase the latter. And in the long run, the only way to do so is by increasing the productivity of labor. But when the productivity of labor is increased in the sectors that produce the commodities that are consumed by the workers, the exploitation rate increases in all economic sectors. But when productivity increases in those sectors whose commodities are not consumed by workers, the overall exploitation rate does not increase. And in fact, it is this increase in productivity, that is to say, the increase in the productivity of labor in those sectors that do not produce the commodities that are consumed by the workers, that ultimately lead to the fall in the rate of profit and the ultimate demise of capitalism, according to Marx. Of course, there's a whole chain of argument there, which would be impossible to present in the course of a presentation, but that's the point. Now, the problem with this so-called deduction of the falling rate of profit argument is that Marx's model of capitalist accumulation hangs on a whole range of assumptions that are by no means evident. The first one is that Marx's labor theory of value only takes into account the time of labor. Whereas when we speak of labor, we speak not just of its time or duration, but also of its form. And the fact is that there is absolutely no satisfactory criteria in Marx's entire work concerning the relationship between the form or the quality of labor and the time or the duration or quantity of labor. In volume 1, he tells us that experience shows that this reduction of any form of labor to a simplified, simple form of labor is constantly being made. But this is obviously not an element of answer, specifically since before writing Capital, he had stated in his Critique of Political Economy of 1859 that this is not yet the time to speak of the laws which govern this reduction. Again, the reduction is about the reduction of various forms of labor, specifically complex forms of labor, to unskilled, simple, manual, basic form of labor, which would then be unique. And if there is only one form of labor, then the only thing that matters is the time of labor. But insofar as we have different forms of labor, It's not just the time of labor that matters, it is also the form of labor that matters. And in fact, when we read Marx's entire work, we notice that he often presents the reduction of all forms of labor to simple, unskilled labor as resulting from the historical tendencies of capitalism. For example, in the Grundrisse, he says that the principle of developed capital is precisely to make unskilled labor superfluous, to transfer skill rather into the dead forces of nature. This is basically the idea of industrialization that renders skilled and complex forms of labor redundant. This is also affirmed several times in volume 3. Later Marxists who have grappled with this problem have mostly also focused on this route. For example, David Harvey, a well-known contemporary Marxist, also says the same thing, right? The reduction from complex to simple work is, as he says it, is the result of real historical process. But the problem is that the historical argument is not actually historically exact, in the sense that even if it is true that historically speaking, throughout the past 2 centuries, we have indeed witnessed the simplification of various forms of skilled labor, but this simplification itself has been rendered possible through the emergence of new forms of skilled labor. So that in fact, what we have witnessed is not simplification of labor, but the replacement of previous forms of skilled labor by new forms of skilled labor. I mean, for example, all the industrial tools that are necessary to simplify certain forms of labor are created, for example, by engineers, designers, scientists, which are utterly even more complex forms of labor. So this is the first limit. The second limit is the unproductive versus productive labor debate. In fact, each and every criterion proposed by Marx in volume 1 and 2, when he discusses this issue, is contradicted by a different criterion. For example, in volume 1, he initially says that only those forms of labor that deal directly with material objects are productive of value. But then he introduces a second criterion saying that to be productive of value, any form of labor, insofar as it is exploited by capitalists, is productive. He gives the example of a schoolmaster and singers, right? Forms of labor that don't deal with any object. But he says that if they are exploited by capitalists, then they are productive of value. The problem is that if this is so, for example, why the labor undertaken in the so-called circulation phase of capital is not productive of value. We can say that those who work in the circulation phase of capital, if they work in a magazine, in a shop belonging to a capitalist and their labor is exploited, then their labor should also be productive of value, so the whole distinction between circulation and production phases of capital would disappear. And worse still, the question, if we take into account the fact that there is no satisfactory way of distinguishing productive and unproductive labor in Marx, the question is why the labor of capitalists, the so-called risk and investment analysis, why is it not productive of value, right? I will come back to this question later on, but just to conclude this first session, I should say that given these 2 shortcomings, one could perfectly imagine an alternative labor theory of value, which would say that, in fact, the increase in the accumulation of capital is not caused by exploiting the labor of laborers, but it is, in fact, as you can see it in the bold, capitalist accumulation is, in fact, driven not by exploiting the unskilled labor of workers, whose labor produces very little value, as in completely repaid by their salary, but by the highly productive labor of capitalists themselves. So in fact, in the whole Marxist analysis of capitalism, the role played by capitalists and the form of labor, complex labor, which is risk and investment analysis, is completely overlooked. And we don't know how. I mean, if Marx had a satisfactory criteria to explain unproductive productive labor or the relationship in forms of labor, it could have been satisfactory, but there is none. So why capitalist labor is not productive of value? Now, to rapidly move on to neo-Ricardianism, so I will come back to Marx. neo-Ricardianism emerged not so much in relation to these two problems, the relation between form of labor and time of labor and unproductive productive labor, but in relation to another problem in Marxist theory, which is the transformation of values into price of production. As it is well known in the third volume, Marx tries to explain the compatibility of his value theory with an idea largely held at the time that because of the role of competition in capitalism, and insofar as barriers to the free reign of competition are overcome, the rates of profit in various production sectors are increasingly equalized. Now, if the rates of profit equalize, it means that the amount of profit in each sector does not just depend on the amount of variable capital, the salary paid to workers, but on the whole investment, variable and fixed capital. And this would be incompatible with the Marxist theory of value, according to which profit only comes from exploiting the variable part of capital, the salary paid to workers. Marx tried to resolve, thought that he could resolve this paradox by arguing that even if in each sector or in each enterprise, there is a divergence between values and prices because of this equalization of the rate of profit, there are two equalities that still hold. The sum of the profits for all the different spheres of production must accordingly be equal to the sum of surplus values, and the sum of prices of production for the total social product must be equal to the sum of its values. By the way, the fact that Marx's value theory even tries, not that it manages, but even only tries to establish the equality of value price only at the level of the entire economy, shows very clearly, as already mentioned by Eugen von Bohm-Bawerk, one of the founders of the Austrian school, that it is an absolutely holist theory. So those who argue that Marx's epistemology is not completely holist, it can be shown that this is actually not the case. Those who worked on this problem of transformation afterwards, specifically, I mean, Eugen von Bohm-Bawerk was one of them, but specifically the Polish-Russian economist Bortkiewicz, they showed that as soon as the transformation is applied to both outputs and inputs of every production cycle, in fact, the two equalities formulated by Marx can no longer be applied. Of course, Bortkiewicz's criticism gave rise to a considerable number of attempts to defend Marx, and as a way, in fact, in which respect, we could even argue that Bortkiewicz's criticism led to the emergence of the neo-Ricardian school, to Sarafa and all the others. These attempts, starting with this criticism of Bortkiewicz, neo-Ricardians noticed increasingly that the very notion of value was in fact completely useless, because value only plays a part insofar as one wants to deduce the falling rate of profit hypothesis. But having noticed, thanks to Bortkiewicz's work, that the law, the tendential fall in the rate of profit was a problematic hypothesis, neo-Ricardians increasingly rejected the falling rate, the tendential fall in the rate of profit hypothesis. And when they rejected it, they noticed that, in fact, there was no longer any use in maintaining the notion of value. And that, as, for example, as it is mentioned by Ian Steedman, one of the famous neo-Ricardians, he says that laying bare the existence of exploitation can be given a coherent explanation in terms which make no reference whatsoever to any value magnitude. And he therefore argues that, therefore, let's just forget about value. It's just a metaphysical thing. We don't need it. So neo-Ricardians actually care no longer about the falling rate of profit, which was the cornerstone of Marx's analysis of capitalism, but exploitation. And this I would just skip over it. I would also skip over the attempts to respond to Bortkiewicz's criticism, which can be shown, as I have shown in other works, which are unsatisfactory, specifically those put forward by Fred Mosley and Andrew Kleeman, the latest attempts to save Marx's theory from criticisms by Bortkiewicz and Bumbaberg. But in fact, the advantage of neo-Ricardian models is that by rejecting the falling rate of profit hypothesis, they manage to construct a more rigorous concept of exploitation that, as I said, no longer needs any notion of value. However, the disadvantage of neo-Ricardian models is that they don't, in fact, allow us to tackle the first two problems identified in Marx's model. That is to say, by rejecting the very concept of value and by rejecting the falling rate of profit hypothesis, the two last problems of Marx's theory, which is the transformation problem, the transformation of values into price of production, but when you no longer have any value, there is no transformation problem. So they don't have these two problems. This is why they are much more coherent theories in terms of their formal consistency compared to Marx's theory. But still, they don't provide any satisfactory response to the first two criticisms that I addressed to Marx's theory. The question of the relationship between various forms of labor and the question of the distinction between productive and unproductive forms of labor. To give an example, for example, most of neo-Ricardian models, they build models where you have capital and labor, and the whole attempt of the model is to show that any increase in products, in the number of products, in the quantity of products, can only be caused by labor, and therefore, if laborers do not get richer as the result of a production cycle, it means that they have been exploited. But again, their whole argument overlooks a simple thing, which is the fact that why shouldn't the labor of capitalists be considered as productive of value or contributing to the productive mechanism? By assuming that it is all about capital and laborers, you see, even by thinking of things in these terms, they have already presumed normatively that capitalists' contribution is nothing but just, let's say, a human embodiment of capital. Whereas, for example, in the Austrian school and in other schools of economics, it is precisely, for example, in Mises, he tries to attribute the whole the origin of prosperity to the activity of entrepreneur. Okay, so in this sense, neo-Ricardians actually the other problem with neo-Ricardians is that when Marx, nonetheless, in spite of the first two problems, the fact that it does not allow us to understand the relationship between different forms of labor, and second of all, in spite of the fact that the distinction between productive and unproductive labor is not clear, at least when it tries to positively analyze capitalism, it gives us a tool to ascertain whether this analysis is valid or not. And it is the falling rate of profit hypothesis. Now, the fact of the matter is that if we study Marx's theory as it has been done later on, in fact, Marx's theory cannot really deduce the falling rate of profit hypothesis because of its internal inconsistencies. But still, at least it says something, right? So my point is that when you have only a positive analysis, which wants to be completely non-normative, in order to make sure that what you're saying is really describing something and is not just, you know, something in the air or a formal model without any correspondence to anything in reality, you should at least be able to predict or to say something about the reality, as Milton Friedman would say afterwards. And Marx's theory at least tried to do so, and the hypothesis of the tendential fall in the rate of profit was at least an attempt, which could have, if it had been positively demonstrate, deduce, it could have been verified or falsified. But in neo-Ricardian models, we don't have any such thing. They just try to deduce the fact of exploitation, but there is nothing said about the dynamics of what they analyze, that is to say, the capitalist formation, which is why, at the end of the day, one could simply reject neo-Ricardian models by saying that, well, the increase in the number of products, in the quantity of products, is not caused by exploiting the labor of laborers, but by the contribution of the labor of the capitalists. In that sense, again, you know, we can have another alternative labor theory of value, which attributes the increase in the wealth under capitalism to the labor of capitalists. Therefore, now to conclude, there were so many things to say, so I maybe said things very fast. I apologize if it was too fast, but as a way of conclusion, I would like to say that it seems to me that one of the problems with these non-normative, let's say, theories of exploitation and accumulation is that they often, bizarrely speaking, they often take the market mechanism of rendering unrelated forms of labor commensurable. It takes that mechanism for granted. Whereas it seems to me that the real issue, if we would like to stick to a labor theory of value, is precisely the fact that the market mechanism of connecting or bringing into a relationship various forms of labor is not an automatic or non-normative mechanism. So in that sense, I think any theory of exploitation is obliged to, I would argue, have a more qualitative analysis of labor relationships, basically arguing that for specific reasons under capitalism, certain forms of labor are not valorized adequately and other forms of labor are valorized disproportionately. So for example, but again, the problem is that such qualitative critiques of capitalism or analysis of exploitation, they need to be done from the basis of an alternative normative model, according to which the way labor relationships are organized under capitalism are unjust or problematic. But insofar as Marx and neo-Ricardians try to propose positive and non-normative analysis of exploitation-based capitalist accumulation, it seems to me that, and I just tried to show very rapidly that they have failed to do so. And as a matter of fact, in Marx, both the theory of exploitation and accumulation are problematic. In neo-Ricardian, the theory of exploitation is formally consistent, but again, there is no reason to prefer it to another labor theory of value, which would simply argue that increase in the riches is not caused by exploiting the labor of employees, but by the highly productive labor of the employers. Thank you so much for your attention. And again, I apologize if sometimes I went too fast. Thank you so much. So I'm glad to have questions if there are any. I'm maybe going to stop the screen. Yes, so can you see me? Okay.
Yes, we can see you.
Okay. I don't know if yes. So yes, there is no question. There is only one name. So if
hello. Yes, this is Joe Persky. Could you comment a little bit, when you say the labor of the capitalists, isn't that in fact the labor of a class that the capitalists in general hire? So somehow it's strata of labor. I mean, I guess where's the rentier in your approach?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you want, this is the whole problem, in the sense that in the Marxian and neo-Ricardian reading, they would like to see capitalists as nothing but rentiers, precisely. Okay, but my whole point is that precisely to see the normativity and the fact that this whole thing boils down to a normative disagreement, whether capitalists are rentiers or are doing something which is not just extracting separate value from the labor of others, but actually doing things. And that is to say, as I said, this doing thing is a highly abstract form of labor, which is the risk and investment analysis. And of course, any, I would say, apologist of capitalism would argue that if this labor of capitalists was not highly important, why is it that for every single capitalist who is successful, there are thousands of capitalists who are unsuccessful? So this shows that this risk and investment analysis that is undertaken by capitalists is a highly significant form of labor under market economy. Now, Marxists and neo-Ricardians have decided to call that non-labor. And then they end up just saying that, in fact, everything is produced by the employees, and so capitalists are just rentiers, right?
But some capitalists do labor and some don't. And the whole history through the 19th century of the capitalists professionalizing all kinds of labor, and especially engineers and business analysts, testifies to the fact that somehow they wanted to pull that away from other workers. I guess it's not necessarily the abstract capitalist who does the labor that you're talking about.
Yeah, I totally understand what you're saying, but I would even argue that even at that level, one can say that, for example, how to put it, this whole debate, if you want, is again about the whole idea of the distinction between productive and unproductive labor, right? And my whole point was that Marx precisely glossed over this debate by hoping to show us the veracity of his analysis via an empirical prediction, which was the falling rate of profit hypothesis. Now, at least you see there, the debate on productive versus unproductive labor is not solved. But if the falling rate of profit had been successfully deduced, we still had something to see whether the formal model is actually true in terms of truly representative of the empirical reality or not. With the neo-Ricardian models, given that we don't have such predictions, the whole thing boils down, again, as I said, it's just a matter of opinion, right? I mean, it's just one prefers to call them rentier, one prefers to call them at the forefront of productivity, as Mises, for example, would do, right? For Mises, entrepreneur is precisely at the origin of increase in productivity and in wealth. So I'm not saying that I would defend the thesis according to which capitalists are at the origin of increase in riches. I'm just saying that any theory that would try to contest this should avow to be a normative critique of capitalism and not a non-normative analysis of capitalism. That is, if you want, my point.
If there's no other question, I might have a question, actually. Thank you very much for this inspiring presentation. So I was just wondering if we think of what qualifies a capitalist as a capitalist in the Marxist system is that he or she is in command of the means of production, right? So therefore, the capitalist is not double free. Therefore, the capitalist does not have to sell his labor power on the market. Therefore, he's not subjected to this relation of exploitation where labor power always sells for less, where the value of labor power is always less than the value created by labor power, right? So I'm just wondering, how that whole notion of double free labor as the condition for labor power selling at less than the value created through labor power figures into your analysis of conceptualizing capitalist labor as value-adding labor.
Absolutely. I think, the problem is that Marx himself does not really follow this definition everywhere. I mean, this definition of what would be an exploited laborer, my argument, my counter argument often is this: if this is so, why is it that, for example, the labor of those who are exploited in the so-called circulation phase of capital, for example, let's say a person who works in a shop who belongs to a capitalist, and the capitalist basically, the person works 10 hours to sell things, and the capitalist pays him just, let's say, the necessary labor time, and the remaining time is pocketed by the capitalist, right? In that sense, why should the labor undertaken in the so-called circulation phase of capital, even by those who are not capitalists, that is to say, by those who are employed by capitalists in the circulation phase, why is it that their labor is considered unproductive? And Marx does consider their labor to be unproductive in volume 2. So my point is that Marx himself is not consistent in applying this criterion, right? Because, okay, if we apply the criterion that you referred to, maybe we can indeed say that, capitalists as owners of the means of production are not productive, okay? But what about those who are employed in the circulation phase? And I should bring your attention to the fact that if the labor of those who work in the circulation phase is considered as productive of value, the whole Marxian distinction between production phase and circulation phase would collapse. So this is why Marx could not actually consider the labor to be productive. You see, so my point is that Marx himself is not, it's just one of the criteria that he uses, and he does not apply it consistently.
Well, but I think there is a difference between the wage being paid to the store labor, say the cashier, and the capitalist, in the sense that the wage that goes to the cashier is regulated by the rate of exploitation, in the sense that this person would have as a fallback option to work in the factory, right? So it could go work in the factory or work in the store, but it could not set up its own store, right? So in that sense, it could not.
No, absolutely. No, but that is for sure. But my point is that why is it that Marx considers the labor of the cashier as unproductive of labor, of value, right? I was not comparing the labor of the cashier with the labor of the capitalist. I was saying that given that, according to what you just said, that criterion, the labor of the cashier should be considered as productive of value, because the cashier does not own the means of production, right? And is exploited by the shop owner. But Marx continues to consider in the manuscripts of volume 2, which are the latest manuscripts of the 3 volumes that he has written, he continues to consider the labor of those who are employed in the circulation phase to be unproductive of value. So in that sense, you see, the criterion that you say is not something that Marx would himself consider as a valid criterion that we could really apply to understand the distinction between productive and unproductive labor. Mm. You see, in that sense, my point, so in that sense, when people say the labor of capitalists is not productive of value, I would say, give me any criterion in Marx that could allow us indeed to exclude the labor of capitalists from being considered as productive, while not excluding, for example, the labor of those working in advertisement or cashiers and people like them, who are not owners of the means of production, as unproductive as well. So that is what I was trying to say when I said that, for example, this is what I analyzed in my thesis. There are 5, 6 various criteria that Marx employs in Capital 1 and 2 to distinguish productive and unproductive labor, and each of them is contradicted by another one. So in the end, we are just left with a number of criteria that we can't really apply them because each one is, as I said, contradicted by another one. So ultimately, it is very difficult to understand what Marx really relies on to label any form of label as productive or unproductive.
Mm. I leave it at that, but maybe there are more questions from the audience.
But by the way, so this was also based on a paper which has not been published yet, but it's about to be published. So I can also send the paper to anyone who was interested. So I think maybe their things are a little bit clearer because there are so many notions. The problem with Marx is that he uses so many notions like unproductive, productive, and then when one speaks, it could become a little bit difficult to follow. I totally know that. I mean, I've had the same difficulty myself. I apologize again if things were not clear at certain moments.
Okay, I guess we can call one last time for more questions. Seems like there are no more questions.
Yes, we will. Yes, there is a. It is said that they can link to papers on the website. Absolutely, yes. I will send you the PDF so that you can put them on the website. Yes, indeed.
Yeah, I will do the same. So I guess we can say that both our papers will be available on the website in the same place where our session is currently being announced. So it's sad that we can't see all of you. Thank you so much for taking time to attend our session. And I guess that brings us to the end of it.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for your participation, and it was a big pleasure to be with you.
Great pleasure. Thank you so much. Very nice to meet you.
Thank you so much. Have a nice evening. I mean, it depends on where you are, but for me it's evening, so I'd say have a nice evening.
And maybe if you still have any comments or questions on the presentation, I would be delighted to receive emails from you.
Absolutely, yes. Yes, me too. I'd be very delighted to receive.
I will post my email address in that chat box before we close the session.
Okay, I'm going to end the recording. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much, Amy. I hope,
Thank you.
I think we took a little bit longer than what we should have, but I apologize. I hope it was not so boring and uninteresting in my talk.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm just gonna post my